The pews are emptying, not slowly, not gradually, but in a mass exodus that churches across America are scrambling to understand. 22-year-old Sarah had attended Cornerstone Baptist Church every Sunday since she was born. Her baby dedication photo hung in the church nursery, her baptism certificate framed in her childhood bedroom. But on a crisp October morning in 2019, she walked out of service halfway through the pastor's sermon and never returned. She wasn't alone. Over the past decade, nearly 40% of young evangelicals have quietly slipped away from the faith that once defined their entire worldview. This isn't just about changing denominations or finding a new church home. This is about an entire generation walking away from Christianity altogether, leaving behind communities, families, and belief systems that shaped every aspect of their upbringing. The statistics tell a story that church leadership can no longer ignore. While older evangelicals remain steadfast in their faith, those under 35 are departing at unprecedented rates, creating what researchers are calling the largest religious shift in American history. But what's driving this theological migration? The answers lie buried in decades of cultural tension, political entanglement, and a growing chasm between traditional evangelical teachings and the values that define modern young adults. To understand this exodus, we need to journey back to where it all began, tracing the roots of evangelicalism and examining how a movement that once attracted millions of young believers has become something they can no longer embrace. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we explore the untold stories that shape our world. I'm fascinated to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know your profession too. I love seeing how diverse our community is. If you're finding value in these deep dives into contemporary history, consider leaving a super thanks to help us continue bringing you these important stories. The story begins in the 1940s with a young preacher named Billy Graham, whose stadium crusades would transform American Christianity. Graham represented a new kind of evangelical leader, one who could pack football stadiums and speak to presidents while maintaining the fundamental beliefs that conservative Protestants held dear. His movement emphasized personal relationships with Jesus Christ, biblical inerrancy, and the need for spiritual rebirth, creating a distinctly American form of Christianity that would dominate religious discourse for decades. But evangelicalism wasn't just about theology, it was about culture. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, evangelical churches became community centers where families built lifelong friendships. Children attended youth groups and summer camps, and entire social networks revolved around shared faith. The movement gave people identity, purpose, and belonging in an increasingly complex world. Young people flocked to evangelical colleges, married within the faith, and raised their children in the same traditions that had shaped their own lives. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s presented evangelicals with their first major challenge. As America grappled with civil rights, Vietnam, and changing sexual norms, evangelical leaders positioned their movement as a moral alternative to what they saw as societal decay. They built a parallel culture complete with Christian schools, Christian music, Christian publishing houses, and Christian entertainment. Parents could raise their children entirely within this evangelical ecosystem, protecting them from secular influences while reinforcing biblical values. This protective bubble worked remarkably well for several generations. Evangelical megachurches sprouted across suburban America, Christian rock concerts filled arenas, and young people wore their faith proudly through WWJD bracelets and True Love Waits pledges. The movement seemed unstoppable, claiming nearly 25% of the American population by the early 2000s. Youth pastors perfected the art of making Christianity cool, with contemporary worship music, cutting-edge technology, and youth programs that rivaled anything the secular world could offer. But beneath this polished exterior, cracks were already forming. The same information age that allowed churches to create slick presentations and connect with young people also gave those young people unprecedented access to ideas and perspectives their parents never encountered. While evangelical leaders preached about absolute truth and biblical authority, their children were discovering that the world was far more complex than Sunday school lessons had suggested. The first major blow came from science. Young evangelicals, many of whom excelled in biology, chemistry, and physics, found themselves caught between their faith and their education. Churches taught young earth creationism and intelligent design, but university classrooms presented overwhelming evidence for evolution and an ancient universe. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Many young believers spent years trying to reconcile these competing explanations, consulting apologetics websites and attending creation seminars, only to conclude that their churches had been teaching them incorrect information about the natural world. Seminary student Marcus Thompson spent 3 years researching biblical archaeology, hoping to strengthen his faith through academic study. Instead, he discovered that many of the historical claims he'd been taught since childhood lacked archaeological evidence. The Exodus story that had inspired countless sermons showed no trace in Egyptian records. The conquest of Canaan described in Joshua contradicted what archaeologists had uncovered about ancient Palestine. Thompson found himself questioning not just specific biblical stories, but the entire framework of biblical inerrancy that formed the foundation of evangelical theology. But it wasn't just science and history creating problems. Young evangelicals were increasingly uncomfortable with their church's teachings on sexuality and gender roles. Growing up alongside LGBTQ classmates and friends, they struggled to reconcile their personal relationships with doctrines that condemned homosexuality as sinful. Many had witnessed firsthand the pain caused by conversion therapy and church rejection of gay members. The evangelical insistence that homosexuality was a choice seemed absurd to a generation that understood sexual orientation as an intrinsic characteristic. Gender roles presented another source of tension. While feminist movements had transformed secular society, many evangelical churches maintained complementarian theology that restricted women's leadership roles and emphasized male authority in marriage. Young women who excelled in school and careers found these restrictions increasingly anachronistic. They watched talented female friends leave churches because their gifts weren't welcomed in leadership positions, and they questioned why God would create capable women only to limit their potential. The sexual purity culture that had defined evangelical youth ministries for decades began backfiring spectacularly. True Love Waits campaigns and purity rings had promised that sexual abstinence before marriage would result in fulfilling intimate relationships afterward. But many young evangelicals discovered that years of shame-based messaging about sexuality created lasting psychological damage that didn't disappear on their wedding nights. Support groups for purity culture survivors emerged, filled with individuals struggling to overcome the toxic messages they'd internalized about their bodies and desires. Jessica Martinez still remembers the youth group lesson where her pastor explained that girls who had sex before marriage were like chewed gum that no one would want. She carried that metaphor for 15 years, through college, graduate school, and into her career as a social worker. Even after leaving evangelicalism, she struggled with feelings of worthiness and self-acceptance. Her story echoes thousands of others from young people who internalized these destructive messages during their formative years. Religious trauma became a recognized phenomenon as counselors began treating increasing numbers of former evangelicals dealing with anxiety, depression, and identity crises related to their church experiences. The protective bubble that had sheltered previous generations now felt suffocating to young adults who valued authenticity and emotional health. They began recognizing spiritual abuse in authoritarian church structures and manipulative doctrines that controlled behavior through fear and guilt. The political transformation of evangelicalism accelerated this exodus dramatically. While the movement had always leaned conservative, the 2016 and 2020 elections revealed the extent to which partisan politics had shaped evangelical identity. Young believers watched their pastors and church elders enthusiastically support political candidates whose personal behavior contradicted everything they'd been taught about Christian character and morality. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Climate change became another breaking point. Young evangelicals facing an environmental crisis that would define their futures found their churches largely silent or actively dismissive of climate science. Some evangelical leaders promoted prosperity theology that emphasized material blessings, while others preached that environmental concerns were irrelevant because Jesus would return soon. Young people passionate about creation care felt abandoned by institutions they expected to lead on moral issues. The prosperity gospel movement particularly alienated millennials and Gen Z, who witnessed evangelical celebrities living in mansions and flying private jets while preaching about financial blessings for faithful followers. The stark contrast between gospel messages about caring for the poor and the lavish lifestyles of prominent evangelical leaders created cynicism about the movement's priorities and authenticity. Social justice issues revealed perhaps the deepest philosophical divide. Young evangelicals, influenced by broader cultural movements toward equality and inclusion, expected their churches to champion racial justice, economic equality, and human rights. Instead, they often encountered resistance to addressing systemic racism, indifference to economic inequality, and hostility towards social justice movements. Many felt that their churches had abandoned the prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power in favor of maintaining political alliances and institutional comfort. The Black Lives Matter movement created particularly intense conflicts within evangelical churches. Young white evangelicals who supported racial justice found themselves at odds with church leadership and older members who dismissed or opposed the movement. Young black evangelicals faced the painful realization that their white brothers and sisters in faith often prioritized political loyalty over racial solidarity. The church that was supposed to model God's kingdom on earth instead reflected and reinforced the racial divisions of broader society. Immigration policies created similar tensions. Young evangelicals who had participated in mission trips to Latin America and befriended international students struggled to understand how their churches could support policies that separated families and demonized immigrants. The disconnect between missionary zeal abroad and anti-immigrant sentiment at home highlighted what many saw as hypocrisy in evangelical political positions. The COVID-19 pandemic served as a final catalyst for many wavering young evangelicals. Churches that resisted public health measures, downplayed the severity of the virus, or promoted conspiracy theories lost credibility with young people who trusted scientific expertise and valued community responsibility. Watching church leaders prioritize political statements over public health during a global crisis reinforced perceptions that evangelicalism had lost its moral authority. Online communities provided alternative sources of support and information as young people began questioning their faith. Former evangelicals connected through social media platforms, sharing their stories and finding validation for their experiences. YouTube channels, podcasts, and blogs created new networks of support that didn't exist for previous generations of religious doubters. The isolation that once kept questioning believers within their churches was replaced by thriving communities of people navigating similar journeys. Deconstruction became the term used to describe the process of dismantling previously held religious beliefs. Unlike simple apostasy or rebellion, deconstruction involved careful examination of specific doctrines, historical claims, and ethical teachings. Many young people approach this process with scholarly rigor, reading theology, church history, and biblical scholarship that their churches had never exposed them to. They discovered that many questions they'd been told not to ask had been explored by academic theologians for centuries. The emotional toll of deconstruction cannot be understated. Leaving evangelicalism often meant losing entire social networks, straining family relationships, and abandoning deeply held beliefs about eternal salvation and divine purpose. Many young people described feeling orphaned, losing not just their faith but their entire worldview and community identity. Some compared it to grieving a death, mourning the loss of certainty, community, and meaning that their faith had provided. Family relationships suffered tremendously as young adults chose different paths from their evangelical upbringings. Parents who had raised their children to be strong believers felt confused and heartbroken when those same children announced they could no longer participate in family faith traditions. Holiday gatherings became minefields of theological disagreement and emotional tension. Some families managed to maintain relationships despite religious differences, but others experienced permanent fractures that left lasting wounds on both sides. The economic dimension of this exodus deserves attention as well. Young people who had attended expensive Christian colleges, often accumulating significant debt, sometimes felt betrayed when their educational experiences failed to prepare them for intellectual challenges to their faith. Those who had planned careers in ministry, missions, or Christian organizations faced difficult decisions about their professional futures when their beliefs changed. Some felt trapped in religious vocations they no longer believed in, while others abandoned years of specialized training to start over in secular careers. Mental health issues plagued many young people navigating this transition. Religious trauma therapy became a specialized field as counselors recognized the unique challenges faced by those leaving high-control religious environments. Anxiety disorders, depression, and identity crises were common among former evangelicals who had to reconstruct their entire sense of self, apart from the faith that had previously defined them. Yet for many, leaving evangelicalism also brought tremendous relief and personal growth. Former believers described feeling free to pursue authentic relationships, explore new ideas, and develop personal ethics based on empathy and reason rather than religious authority. Many found meaning in humanitarian work, environmental activism, and social justice causes that their former churches had neglected or opposed. Some young people leaving evangelicalism migrated to more progressive Christian denominations that affirmed LGBTQ rights, ordained women, accepted evolution, and prioritized social justice. Episcopal, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches experienced growth among former evangelicals, seeking to maintain Christian identity while embracing more inclusive theology. Others explored alternative spiritualities, Eastern religions, or philosophical frameworks that provided meaning without requiring supernatural beliefs. The religious nouns category, including atheists, agnostics, and those claiming no religious affiliation, swelled with former evangelicals who abandoned organized religion entirely. Secular communities, humanist organizations, and atheist groups welcomed these new members while helping them navigate the practical challenges of leaving faith-based identities behind. What does this exodus mean for the future of evangelicalism? Demographic trends suggest that without significant changes, the movement will continue shrinking as older believers pass away and younger generations remain absent. Some evangelical leaders recognize this crisis and are attempting reforms to address young people's concerns. Progressive evangelical voices advocate for creation care, racial justice, and more inclusive attitudes toward LGBTQ individuals. But they face significant resistance from traditional evangelical power structures. The churches that manage to retain young people often do so by softening controversial positions or avoiding divisive topics altogether. Some evangelical institutions are quietly evolving their stances on evolution, climate change, and gender roles while maintaining traditional rhetoric for older constituents. This incremental change may slow the exodus, but it may also be too little, too late for a generation that has already moved on. The broader implications extend beyond religious institutions to American politics and culture. Evangelicalism has provided crucial support for conservative political movements for decades. As young people abandon these churches, the political coalition that has dominated Republican politics may face significant challenges. Progressive movements are gaining supporters from former evangelicals who bring passion for social change, informed by their negative experiences with religious conservatism. Educational institutions face particular challenges as young evangelicals who valued learning discover that their Christian colleges and universities haven't prepared them for intellectual engagement with secular scholarship. Some schools are attempting to maintain religious identity while improving academic rigor, but others may face existential crises as their target demographics shrink and their reputations suffer. For families navigating these changes, the challenge lies in maintaining relationships across growing ideological divides. Some parents are learning to love and accept children whose life paths differ dramatically from their expectations. Others are doubling down on religious commitment, hoping to prevent additional family members from experiencing similar faith crises. The success of these family negotiations often determines whether young people maintain any connection to their religious heritage or sever ties completely. The exodus also raises questions about religious liberty and pluralism in American society. As evangelical political influence wanes, Debates over issues like same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and religious exemptions may shift in favor of more secular approaches. Former evangelicals often become passionate advocates for separating church and state, having experienced firsthand what they see as the dangers of religious overreach in politics. Mental health professionals are developing new approaches to help both those leaving evangelicalism and those remaining within it. Families in crisis need counseling strategies that respect religious beliefs while addressing the real trauma that can result from religious environments. Support groups for parents of children who have left the faith provide spaces for processing grief and learning new relationship skills. Looking ahead, the story of young people leaving evangelicalism reflects broader changes in how Americans approach authority, community, and meaning-making. Traditional institutions across society, from political parties to corporations to media outlets, face similar challenges maintaining credibility with younger generations who value authenticity, transparency, and ethical consistency above institutional loyalty. The internet has democratized access to information in ways that make it impossible for any institution to control the narrative the way churches once could. Young people can fact-check sermons in real time, connect with others who share their doubts, and explore alternative perspectives that previous generations never encountered. This information revolution affects all institutions, but it may be particularly challenging for religious organizations that have traditionally claimed exclusive access to spiritual truth. As we watch this unprecedented religious transformation unfold, we're witnessing more than just changing church attendance statistics. We're observing a fundamental shift in how young Americans construct identity, find community, and make meaning in their lives. The exodus from evangelicalism represents both loss and liberation, both crisis and opportunity, both ending and beginning. The young people leaving evangelical churches aren't simply rebelling against their parents or following secular trends. They're making carefully considered decisions based on their understanding of truth, morality, and authentic living. Whether evangelicalism can adapt to address their concerns or will continue shrinking as an increasingly elderly and isolated movement remains an open question that will shape American religious life for generations to come. This migration away from evangelicalism reflects deeper questions about how religious traditions survive and evolve in rapidly changing societies. Can institutions built on claims of unchanging truth adapt to new knowledge and cultural shifts? How do communities maintain identity while addressing legitimate criticisms from within? These challenges aren't unique to evangelicalism, but they're playing out in particularly dramatic fashion within American Christianity. The human stories behind these statistics remind us that religious change is never just about doctrine or demographics. It's about individuals wrestling with their deepest beliefs, families navigating unprecedented changes, and communities struggling to maintain cohesion amid fundamental disagreements. Understanding this exodus requires empathy for all involved, recognizing the pain experienced by those leaving and those left behind. As this story continues to unfold, we'll be watching to see whether evangelicalism can reinvent itself for a new generation, or will become a historical footnote in the longer story of American religion. The choices made by current church leaders and the experiences of young people still within evangelical communities will determine which direction this massive movement ultimately takes. What remains certain is that the landscape of American Christianity has been permanently altered, and there's no returning to the certainties that once seemed so solid. This has been Professor Archive, exploring the forces reshaping our contemporary world. The exodus from evangelicalism represents one of the most significant religious shifts in modern American history, with implications that extend far beyond church walls into politics, culture, and society itself. As always, history is being written by the choices people make today, and we'll continue following these stories as they develop.